just going to jump into the second one, if that's okay.
Yep.
I'm just going to take a note here. Problem with when we start, when you're talking about like different topics like that, like I felt like you could just like continue on, but it's better you just keep going.
It was good.
Yeah. Let's open up the door for NFL free agency and see what actually is going to happen. And I have an interesting question to ask my guests today as well as we move through here, looking at second-year quarterbacks and a third-year quarterback to try and see if we can piece together the timeline of what happens at the QB position. Maybe there's something exploitable there as we move forward. I'm joined by Erik Beimfohr of spikeweek.com. Erik, we did a show, came out earlier this week, looking at some of the zero RB and what it means for 2025, because it's been something that has been kind of bubbling under the surface for me, wanting to get out and talk about. And I thought you were the perfect guest to have on to talk through it. I think we covered a lot of interesting areas, and I'd be interested in what the listeners have decided. You know, are they ready to get back in the zero RB streets, the hero RB streets again for 2025? I would imagine if you're listening into this show with myself, or if you're listening into Erik's content, you probably didn't need convincing. We are going to talk some free agency today. And what I want to start off with is what transaction from free agency, you know, made the biggest impact, either positively or negatively for fantasy. We've seen some players re-sign. Maybe it's the case that, you know, we've seen T. Higgins. I was hoping T. Higgins would have landed on a different team, mainly the Washington Commanders. But what do you think is going to be the one where we look back in 12 months and be like, if you think back 12 months ago, Saquon Barkley lands with the Eagles, completely changes the entire course of history in the NFL. Maybe it won't be that big, but what's sitting on your mind is a pretty interesting transaction.
So the one that jumps out to me is not only because it's focused on this individual player or the team he was on or the team he has now moved to. It's like this crazy trickle-down effect that impacts so many players is I'll call it Cooper Kupp. We could probably call it Davante Adams if we wanted to as well, but Davante comes with his own, can of worms that we don't necessarily need to. That impacts Rodgers and all right, but Cooper Kupp, essentially, we found out they were letting him go. They hadn't let him go as of yet or traded him or anything like that, but we knew Cooper Kupp wasn't going to be on the Rams any longer. So that then opened the doors for them to go get Davante Adams, which impacts clearly Davante Adams, right? An aging wide receiver who can be a little tricky to take at sometimes. But if you're the 1B or the 2 on the Rams, with Matthew Stafford coming back, Sean McVay, a talented offense that produces fantasy points and is really, really concentrated, right? It has been Puka and Kupp or just one when the other is out there. Kyren Williams, maybe a sprinkle of the other guys. So now we have that, where you have this kind of dynamic Rams offense, assuming Davante is more of what he showed last year and maybe Cooper Kupp is not so good. Maybe that's big for Davante. It could be big for Stafford. It could be big for Kyren Williams because maybe they're scoring more points and there's this trickle down.
Could be bad for Kyren Williams. I know that the team they do want to run him in there, but like Davante Adams is one of the best, like inside the 10-yard wide receivers of all time.
Yeah. And as great as Puka is, he's fine there and Kupp's not good there. So, right, like you said, maybe that's because the Kyren thing is staff. They don't run QB sneaks, right? Stafford doesn't sneak, and they don't really love to throw down there because they didn't have those guys. Yeah, so then maybe it's Davante, right? Maybe this is a huge boon for Davante Adams, and it's negative for the other guys on the Rams. And then you have the Cooper Kupp thing. So it's kind of this one transaction, if you will, that impacts so many different people. Where is Cooper Kupp? Is it over? Right? Is the first 4 weeks or whatever it was of last season the real Cooper Kupp, where he was, you mentioned in the last show that we recorded, where the first 5 or so weeks you were like, everything is going the opposite of how I thought. That's what I felt about Cooper Kupp. I was like, oh my gosh, Puka goes out and I didn't take nearly enough Cooper Kupp because he's just going absolutely bonkers.
And I think that is forgotten about. Like the end of the season, like tailed off so badly, but like the start of the season was like a fire.
Right. So which one is it? We almost always tend to lean on the end of the season is the truth in terms of like how we price players and how we think about them. And I'm not saying that that's there's anything wrong with that, but it also doesn't mean that that's true. Sometimes it's an injury. Sometimes, who knows? Something happened down the stretch. A player got sick or whatever, right? And we just don't know some of those things. It reminded me because I know this is a football podcast, but Mookie Betts of the Los Angeles Dodgers was down like 20 pounds, and he only weighed like 180 before. He hasn't been able to keep food down for like weeks or whatever. And it's like, in the old days, we just wouldn't even have known that.
Yeah.
And so if you didn't know, if there was something wrong with Cooper Kupp that we just didn't know, and that's what caused the decline, and he pops back up and he's awesome, you're like, well, now all of a sudden the Seattle offense looks a little better, right? Metcalf was gone. You're like, oh no, this is going to be bad. Maybe Cooper Kupp is fine. Maybe JSN really can play on the outside really effectively. Kupp comes in, they can move each guy around, and
maybe Sam Howell's like the
Howell,
QB one.
the Sam twins, they're a Spider-Man meme, Howell and Darnold in the QB room, but maybe it makes Darnold a more appealing late round guy. Maybe Kupp comes in and alleviates some pressure from JSN. Now JSN ascends into superstardom, right? Maybe it's good for Ken Walker or Charbonnet, or the truth is that Cooper Kupp was terrible, and it's over, right? His career is over, the thing we saw at the end of last year. And now you have a terrible and dusty slot receiver who comes in and plays next to this emerging slot receiver. Do they have to move JSN outside because Kupp can't do it? And that's bad for right? There's this crazy.
But then like Sam Darnold might be a value if you have JSN ascending and Kupp still having some, but then he becomes worthless. If Kupp, like, he needs the two of them. And then the other part, a lot of the time when we have free agency, we'll have like an incoming player comes in, an outgoing player goes out. So it could be just, you're taking in Adams, you're taking Kupp out. But what's happened this offseason is like with, Geno Smith going to the Raiders, then you have Sam Darnold going to the Seahawks. You also have their quarterbacks changing. Then you have, even if we go to the Steelers and, at the point of recording, Aaron Rodgers still hasn't signed. Eventually, I'm expecting that to happen. But you have like, even Justin Fields now with the Jets. A lot of the time you have like some movement, or you have like a rookie quarterback, or you have somebody coming in for competition. This offseason, we've had like just like 3 or 4 teams are like, we'll just swap all our players around. We'll just change them around these teams. It's like they've done like a supplemental draft.
Yeah, exactly. They're an expansion team, and it's the new Seattle. Yeah, they're going to change their name to whatever, and it's the
Seattle Steelers.
They got to keep JSN, and and then we'll start over from scratch. But I almost feel like whatever becomes the truth, whatever we find out in 10 months or whatever was the truth about Cooper Kupp, could ultimately like even decide this season. Nothing, one individual thing ever really does that. But if Cooper, like you said, if Cooper Kupp is totally washed, like this Seahawks offense is about as fragile as it. I mean, you want to talk about a house of cards. Sam Darnold not on the Vikings anymore, off of one good season where he also showed us at the end that he still had that old school Sam Darnold seeing ghost guy in him. JSN, can he play, right? He had a really good season last year, but can he grow even more, right? Because he's going to have to when it's Cooper Kupp and not DK Metcalf alongside him. What does this do for Ken Walker, right? He's already got a new offensive coordinator. Do they seem to love Ken Walker still? But if the offense tanks, I don't want this like big play home run hitter, terrible success rate runner in one of the worst offenses in the NFL. There's this insane snowball effect that could happen from both positively and negatively on 2 different teams, maybe multiple 3-4 different teams, all because of this Cooper Kupp transaction. And I'll be honest, I don't know what the right answer is. I'm very, very terrified of the Seattle Seahawks situation, but I know that's I think the biggest one that has the most impact across like the most players in the player pool.
Yeah, and I think you can pair that even further. Like you mentioned some of it, but like he ends up in Seattle because DK Metcalf's now in, Pittsburgh. Like there's the other parts that have moved. So I think we can, and I do think that when we look through all the players that are involved,
Geno moves places. I'm not saying it's because of Cooper Kupp, but it's kind of sort of related, right? They tore it down and moved on.
The whole influx of that, like even then, if you go to the Geno part, you're looking at like, how does that affect Brock Bowers? So we could say that kind of Seattle and the Rams transition of their players over the past like 6 weeks or so. I do think that that's going to have a huge impact on fantasy. And then it becomes, do you lean into it? Do you like, which side are you going to take? Are you going to like we talked about in the last show, are you going to be like, I'm not sure, so I'm just going to kind of try and stay on the fence and take some sides? You're going to take none of it. It's going to be interesting, and the players that are involved, like it's you have those age and veteran players, and you want to take like the ascending JSN, but maybe if Darnold can't deliver, the JSN isn't the one to be like adding onto the roster. A lot of nuance that's going to be fun to track as we move through here and when we're doing our drafts, of course, and seeing how it all settles down. But the other question that leads me to is, did any team actually improve their quarterback situation this offseason? So the only one that was kind of traded was the Geno Smith to the Raiders. But you also, like, even for the Rams, like every season it seems to happen, but at the end of the season, it feels like Stafford's arm is just gone. It's like if you were playing like a video game, there's like a strength bar, and like by the end of the season, that strength bar is empty. It's not even unread. It's complete. So we kind of see this each and every year with him, but he was looking like he may move, and then he's back, and a lot of shuffling around. Then how like is there any of the teams where you're like, oh, I'm confident? Like even Geno last year, there was times where there was some nice play, but he threw some of the worst red zone interception I've ever seen last year. And you're in a situation now. There's no way we're saying there's no way he can't be an upgrade on what was there last year for the Raiders. So I think he's probably the main upgrade. But looking around, do you see many things that you'd say this is definitely an upgrade on what we had last year?
No, I would not say definitely.
And we had a lot of quarterbacks move. Like it's not like, oh, there's only 3 options. There's like 6 or 7 options.
I think it speaks to how bad quarterback play is outside of the top 15 or 16 guys in the NFL. That's why I know he turned into a corpse last year, but that's why the annual like Kirk Cousins stinks, stuff that we would hear every single year is like, boy, the grass is not always greener, guys, because Cousins is not elite, of course, but man, you can do a lot worse than Kirk Cousins. And I think a third or half the teams in the NFL are feeling that right now. But the problem is, particularly with this rookie class, with no kind of like backups, like really sexy backups that you'd get the I'm not saying Jimmy G turned out, but we would have the Jimmy G's and the Matt Flynn's, right? And the whatever. We would get those guys where you could at least tell yourself a story that you're getting a pretty talented guy. The Lions could probably trade Hendon Hooker for a 2nd round pick at this point. I think somebody would invest in like, just give me something that gives me some optimism at quarterback that isn't Jameis or Aaron Rodgers, right? Or Daniel Jones. Like it's an absolute disaster. So to me, the answer is 100% Geno. I've drafted a lot of Geno over the last couple of years. I've drafted a lot of Seahawks, and so it's also been a roller coaster. But I think a lot of that has been Seattle related. The offensive line, which is part of the concern for Sam Darnold, with Darnold behind one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL. Geno's been dealing with that. With God bless DK Metcalf, but like he just like can only do one thing on the outside. Yeah. And so it's like, if Geno doesn't get time to throw, he's not a super willing shot taker, right? This isn't Russ or Jameis or something like that. And so, but that in this new situation, get an offensive line upgrade. Hopefully they can add a little more to the wide receiver room, but you have Brock Bowers in place. You do have some veteran wide receivers that are at least somewhat trustworthy. And like I said, maybe a rookie or something at wide receiver can add a little bit more juice. I just think it's such a huge up. It can't get much worse than Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew, although many teams are trying to put that to the test. I just think he's also a perfect fit for kind of what they want to do. Their best player is a yak god tight end who gets open underneath, and that's what Geno wants to do. Is let's throw it underneath, get the ball out quickly, and he's arguably the most accurate passer in the NFL now, with some of these other guys aging out. And so give me that accuracy on the Raiders team, and total wheels up for Brock Bowers. And at least Raiders fans can like be at least confident it's not going to be a stone disaster at quarterback every single Sunday.
Yeah, I think at the minute and like an underdog, he's going in the 14th round, QB 27, right next, funny enough, to Sam Darnold, who's the next QB off the board post him. But I do think that you mentioned the accuracy, and I mentioned, some of the bad interceptions. Still not 100% sure how those interceptions occurred, but when you're looking at like somebody on a third down and like 14 to try and deliver a strike over the middle, now I would probably say that Jayden Daniels may have already surpassed him, but like in terms of strong balls over the middle of the field or trying to fit it into windows, I think Geno is definitely right up there. And there was lots of times last year for a Brock Bowers, hand up in the air, open, wants the ball, but those QBs couldn't deliver those balls. So I do think that he's the winning play there. It'd be interesting to see what the Giants do here in the draft. It feels like you need a starter at the high end of the draft or in the first round, or else a lot of these guys are not really going to be delivering in year one. So I think there's still going to be a case around the NFL where there's a lot of teams that are just in quarterback hell at the moment as we move forward. But one team who we thought was in quarterback heaven, 2 years ago with the rookie season, that was CJ Stroud and the Texans. They come off with a massive start to his career. And then we see Jayden Daniels this year have just a phenomenal start. And I think I certainly expected it more with Daniels, not to the level that he did hit, but I kind of thought that the traits were there from a rushing perspective. And I thought he would be able to do enough on a team that was going to be struggling from behind to be able to put up some points. I didn't think it was going to be a case that would make the playoffs and he would be as good as he truly was. But at this time last year, we're looking at CJ Stroud. And then last year, they take in Stephon Diggs in free agency. We're like, this here is just going to get better and better. Now this offseason, like he's lost Tank Dell for the whole season with the injury that he picked up and the surgeries that he's had to have since. Stephon Diggs is no longer there. They do take in Christian Kirk, but they trade away some of, like they're off. We're talking about the Seahawks offensive line. The Texans offensive line was bad, and then they traded away some of the best parts off that bad offensive line. So my kind of question here is like two-parter. Is the Jayden Daniels part going into year two? Is there a chance that we get overly optimistic where like if they get pieces around him, they get Deebo Samuel, who I think is probably well beyond his peak, and he's kind of in that Cooper, I think he's below Cooper Kupp in that Cooper Kupp conversation, but still it's a piece that they had nothing. And then you have Terry McLaurin, but we're looking at maybe they take something in the draft. I'm interested just to play it back in my head for like last year and the expectations for Stroud going into year two as this like going to be completely dominant and continue to be like this for the next 5, 7, 10 years. And then this year it's like, yeah, CJ Stroud is he's no good. Like it comes at you fast, but like CJ Stroud is going as quarterback 17 right next to Justin Fields, who I like Justin Fields, but if we're looking at like arm talents, like I don't think there's anything comparative there. So it's interesting to see how quickly things can change. And then, Jayden Daniels, amazing season, hoping for the sophomore leap again to even take a step forward. I think if he stays at the same level, we'll be happy, but he's going as QB3 in the 4th round. So there's just like huge differences. And that's kind of where we were looking last year at CJ Stroud going. So my kind of question is on the Stroud side are we being overly pessimistic at that ADP? I think we certainly must be. That like, I think we'll look back at the end of the season that he's somewhere in the middle of where he was last year and where he was the year before, which is still somebody who should be going multiple rounds earlier. But the Jayden Daniels, just there's no sophomore slump coming, is there?
I don't think so.
This is me more playing like devil's advocate to myself. Sure. I'm like, wheels are up. That's never stopping. The Hall of Fame, here we come.
I think from a fantasy perspective, we could say, so this happens every year happened with the Bengals, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it. This probably happens with the Bengals again this year. When you have a terrible defense, that leads to a lot of fantasy points.
Yep.
Right? We've seen this with Jalen Hurts over the years, not just Saquon Barkley stealing touchdowns, but when the Eagles defense is dominant, like they legit will not throw. Yeah, yeah. They will not throw the ball in the second half. And so I remember, I forget who they were playing a couple of years ago. I think it might have been the first Super Bowl that they went to, that he had like 25 fantasy points at halftime and threw 2 passes in the second half, because it was 31-3 at halftime or whatever. And it's like, I know you have a huge lead, but geez, we could throw a couple.
This is almost part of the reason why last year, like the Steelers were like, well, we'll play Russell Wilson, because like we don't need to score very much, because the defense is going to do the job.
Yep. And turns out when you run into Lamar and the Ravens, you probably
Doesn't
need to
matter.
score a couple points. But this has happened to Lamar over the years, right? Where the Ravens defense is just so good. The Lamar's, like points per dropback is as good as it gets, or points per dropback plus rush are just so good. But he only throws 6 passes.
I know it wasn't a fantasy game in the season, but we've seen that against the Texans this year in the playoffs. Like it was over in the mid-second quarter.
Right. And so Jayden Daniels had the luxury. This is just from a fantasy perspective. I don't really think I can make the case other than pure variance that no one can ever possibly see coming that he's not good. I think there were more signs of CJ Stroud than there were of now. It's easy to say now, but I think there were more signs in CJ Stroud's rookie year of like there was a lot of kind of hero ball and a lot of like run around and and hit Tank and hit Nico on. It was very actually Deshaun Watson-esque. When Watson was with Houston, not the same. He was great, but there was some of that to it, right?
Plays that are very hard to repeat.
Yes, non-repeatable big plays. When you have Nico Collins and Tank Dell, you can make a lot of those plays. But then, right, we see him lose Tank. Bobby Slowick, was an absolute disaster. So maybe that's on the pro side. But in terms of Daniels, I think the main thing for me is not anything about him as a football player. It would be about the situation. They do like to run the ball, right? For Cliff, all of his air raid, background. He likes to put the hand in the dirt and grind it out with Brian Robinson and co, Chris Rodriguez and Jerry McNichols and all these guys, right? Getting a ton of carries. So I think you could see less passing from them if the defense gets better. I think that they are very well aware that the defense needs to get better if they want to compete, and which also then leads to less scrambling, right? And that's a big deal for his rushing. So I think he could be just as good in real life, kind of like Patrick Mahomes. Patrick Mahomes has had huge fantasy seasons. Historically when the Chiefs defense wasn't as good, and then as the Chiefs defense got better, they lost Tyreek Hill, and he wasn't as good for fantasy. On the flip side with CJ Stroud, it reminds me so much of Justin Herbert, where Justin Herbert, I think it was after his rookie, has an incredible rookie season after they, jabbed Tyrod or whatever before the game. Yeah, exactly. And Justin Herbert was awesome. And we learned very quickly that Justin Herbert is a star. And so he goes as the QB2 the next year. And it's like, a pocket passer, which is Herbert and Stroud are very similar in their rushing profiles, and that they'll give you something in the occasional game of like 75 yards and a touchdown, but it's usually like
not weekly.
15 rushing yards and a couple touchdowns a year. And so you're really dependent upon heavy passing volume and some efficiency. And so if the situation breaks down at all, it's very hard for them in fantasy. And I mean, the situation was just Stroud was bad himself, but the situation just broke down around him. Stephon Diggs goes down. Tank wasn't quite himself, I don't think, the whole season.
Because he had got injured at the end of the previous season, got back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shattered his leg blocking at the goal line. Genius. Bobby Slowick. I wonder why he got fired. But then they also had a questionable offensive line. And then a coordinator who we ended up not being able to trust to do smart things as a play caller.
I'm just thinking this now. We talked about the zero RB stuff and we named players, and I named Josh Jacobs as one of those guys. But like Joe Mixon had a strong season, but like had no right to have the season that he had. Like that was just like the way they were trying to use the offense. And again, that was detrimental to Stroud. But yeah, just that when you were going through it, just flashed into my head, just some of the plays.
And I forced myself to, we talked a lot on the past show about kind of lessons learned and thinking about some of that stuff. I forced myself to draft some Joe Mixon, not a lot, but he was, and depending upon the room you get in a bunch of me and you and the zero RB bros, and Joe Mixon is not the guy that we like, right? So he would fall very far, and I'd scoop him up a little bit, but because I was so excited for the Texans, I was like, if I love all these wide receivers and CJ Stroud, like I shouldn't have zero Joe Mixon in best ball, right? I don't really like to draft those guys in managed leagues, but in best ball, I just forced myself to take a little bit of that guy. And like you said, you watch the games and you're like, this doesn't make any sense. Like they built the plane out of Joe Mixon, and they have Nico Collins and Tank Dell and Stephon Diggs, and they're
then Nico went down, so obviously it went even heavier. But it got to a point where it's like I have to, like, again, he was getting results, he was getting in the end zone and things like that. So it was almost like, well, that worked, so we have to do it again. It was like we could do this a different way and it would work better. But it was kind of like again, coordination and everything that was happening around it. But yeah, I just see some similarities in terms of how hyped we are for an offense heading into the offseason and how it is moving forward between the two of them. The thing that really disappointed me last offseason, again, there was like the viral clips going around of CJ Stroud breaking down defense, and people are like, oh, this guy's like, it's like Pitt and Manning, this guy's a genius. And then obviously, but I wonder, even from, this is like trying to self-diagnose an NFL player, but I wonder from his perspective, did he like start to think like, oh, this is going to be pretty easy for me, I'm going to do this every year, and then all of a sudden, like, you get hit in the mouth and you're like, I haven't prepared, like you go into like an exam and you're like, oh, I thought it was going to be a different question that we were getting. Yep. So the thing that was really disappointing, though, there was multiple times last year where there was like wide open players that were either overthrown but like some of them on like relatively routine passes, and NFL points and fantasy points left on the field. But it'd be interesting to see maybe this offseason if he does like refocus, but he can't refocus the offensive line. That's not really his job.
Yeah, moving on. I just wanted to quickly add, I think Stroud, as you mentioned, I think we were probably a little out over our skis last year, but now I think we've also kind of, to the chasing our tails point from the last episode, I think we've gone a little bit to the right answer is probably somewhere in the middle. And I do think it's very possible you self-diagnosed accurately. Do you remember I think it was week 1, right? They played the Bears, maybe. They played the Bears and Caleb was atrocious and the Texans won, and Stroud went up to, the quarterbacks shake hands and stuff after the game, and Stroud goes up to Caleb and like pats him on the head and says, like he was acting like he was
like a veteran, like a 10-year veteran.
Just keep working. You're going to be fine. Don't let this get you down.
Keep your head up,
remember. Yeah, keep your head up. Yeah. Keep your head up, kiddo. Like they're like the same age. And he's like, lecturing him. And I'm like, let's pump the brakes. You haven't played that many games yet. And it turns out maybe he wasn't quite ready for, not that he's not ready to be a really good quarterback. Maybe he wasn't ready for the adversity he ended up facing with the situation that he was put in with the offensive line and the coaching and stuff. So I think hopefully lesson learned last year, and we see a much better CJ Stroud.
Yeah, and again, like we're looking at ADP, it's Nico Collins, who I think is very rightly the wide receiver 5 at the minute, going in the top 8 picks. Like a lot of that, his success is going to depend on CJ Stroud being a little bit better here when we're taking him at that particular point off drafts. But yeah, I'm a little bit intrigued to maybe overstock myself on CJ Stroud in his 3rd season here. The other question that fits in kind of to this is like a player who underperformed, potentially was injured or underperformed last season, that you feel is a draft opportunity, this year. And this is always an interesting one because it's not the same thing. I don't think if you think, oh, somebody just had a down year and they're like 29, but like somebody who basically the CJ Stroud kind of profile, looks great, going to be big, doesn't work out. That can be like one of those things, particularly when a player is beyond kind of 26, I would say, where you're like, well, I could just be going into a complete hole here with this player. But you could also be somebody who like starts out, like even like Odell Beckham, like if you remember the first couple of years, it was like complete, like best player of all time. And then like, it's like 5 years in, you're like, undraftable. Like it kind of, Michael Thomas was similar. He had injuries with it, but like they started off with the best starts to the basically NFL history at the wide receiver position. But bounce back sometimes can be a lot harder than you anticipate, and again, your prior years, maybe from 2 years ago, maybe you're like, I got this guy on my roster and he helped me, win a load of money, and you're like, I want to add him. Is there any players though this year that you feel like you're going to find it hard not to click on with kind of optimism of where they're going and how people are viewing them?
Yeah. It is, however, mostly like maybe rookies that disappointed or younger players that disappointed. I struggle with, the bounce back the bounce back 29-year-old is one. It's tricky, and a lot of the times when those guys bounce back, it isn't necessarily like a real bounce back. It's just I'd call it like the Keenan Allen or something, where I'm not really sure that Keenan is any better than we thought that he was going to be. He just, you get a bunch of volume and, because Caleb's frankly terrible and it just kind of, the things worked out well for him. I agree with your assessment of Deebo Samuel, but I also think if we are wrong that he is a corpse of his former self, that the skill set is a really good fit.
Especially with Daniels as well and what the team wants to do. Yeah.
So let's remove the Olamide Zacchaeus and Jamison Crowder and Luke McCaffrey, right? And let's.
You're taking all those targets off the board.
Yeah, let's get those off the board, and maybe not 2,000 targets to Zach Ertz on the 4-yard hitch, and let's throw it to Debo a couple times. If he can still run after catch, I think that the air raid is a really, really good fit for Debo Samuel. I also think Cliff is probably he loves his running backs, and Debo is half running back, so some pop passes, right? If he can still run with make guys miss and be good with the ball in his hands, I think we could see a pretty big bounce back. Now, do I believe that that's going to happen? Nah, not necessarily, but again, it's kind of like what we talked about in last episode. If the market says, no, it's over. It's over for Debo. I'm going to sprinkle some Debo in there because if they're wrong, it could be a pretty darn big season because there's a lot of juice to squeeze out of even as dominant as Terry McLaurin was. This isn't like a 30% target share player. So there's a lot out there to be had in Washington. A couple rookies that I wanted to shout out that I haven't given up on. Well, Marvin Harrison, I think, is a pretty notable one. I'm not giving up on that kind of profile in a single season. I'm not particularly bullish on, similar to the CJ Stroud thing, like the situation that he's in. Have become pretty worried about Kyler as a facilitator. Like
Kyler can see right and left of the offensive line. He just can't see over it.
So Marv Marv. You remember when Hopkins was there, right? That was all. It was back shoulder fade, fade, hitch, jump ball, right? And he stayed on the left side. And I know that was with Cliff, but he stayed on one side and he never ran over the middle of the field. Now, part of that's Nuke. I think that's a little bit of his preference and his skill set anyway. But we do need some more diversity in the way Marv is deployed. And I'm not sure that we're going to get that, but I'm never going to give up in 1 year on that kind of profile. Just like I didn't give up on JSN, just like I didn't give up on Jameson Williams. Like I'm not going to give up on those guys right away. The talent is just too good to pass up on. And then another rookie on that Bears team that Keenan Allen is no longer on is Rome Odunze. Another really talented prospect that I liked. I was maybe a little bit more lukewarm than the market. It wasn't that I liked him. It was just, I think some other people liked him a little bit more than I did. Like I had Ladd over Rome as a prospect. The NFL definitely did not agree with that assessment, but I thought he was more in that tier of wide receiver, but really, really good football player. There's, Ben Johnson, Caleb Williams, hopefully taking a step, more target opportunity. The offensive line has drastically, you want to talk about an offensive line improving versus they just brought in 3 vets to shore up the interior of that offensive line for Chicago. That's huge for Caleb. We know he turns into a chicken with his head cut off when he gets some pressure, especially up the middle. Get a little more stability for Caleb, a great coach that we trust, and some more targets available for Rome. I think Ben Johnson's going to put him to use, and I'm really, really bullish for year 2 for Odunze.
Yeah, I think especially like people do give up too quickly, and if they drafted a rookie last year, and like maybe some people still are very hesitant to drafting rookies, and I think it's very important. Like when we're talking and doing shows like this, sometimes I did a question at the end of the last show where we talked about something that you've learned to kind of give advice to somebody who's new to it. But like when these videos are up on YouTube or somebody listens to the podcast or listening for the first time, like it's not all like everyone's not jumping in and just drafting like 6 rookies on every roster. And if you do, and then this year you're like, well, I'm not drafting any rookies because it didn't work out last year. Like the rookies are something that is key to a lot of these builds because they're getting better as the season goes along. You mentioned Debo Samuel. I think, Brandon Ayuk has almost been forgotten about. He's obviously coming off his injury. He's going wide receiver 44, could be interesting. There is just some players that are sitting there that are quite unique at this particular point of the year. Dalton Kincaid, I noticed, didn't get a mention. Tight end 14. Now I think we're sailing on that ship. Are we? We're gone.
I think it's too expensive. I think I'm always. I mean, I've bought Kyle Pitts, so it's not like I've bought Kyle Pitts every year of his career. So who am I to say that you can't buy Dalton Kincaid? But I mean, Pitts has shown more.
It's been devastating the way it has played out so far for his career. The other player that I feel probably fits the mold, but the Packers offense last year, maybe this is a reason to buy in. The Packers offense last year was so disappointing in terms of how, I guess, Jordan Love played and how the offense went from a pass perspective to a running perspective. And obviously we had a great run for Josh Jacobs, who's now a 2nd round pick. But again, that Cinderella story can change very quick, and maybe it does go back. But the player that I'm leaning in here and talking about is Jayden Reed. He is wide receiver 36 at the moment, and I think his talent is much more than that. But last year was a huge disappointment from what we got from him. But I think that's true for the entire Packers passing offense. Outside of Tucker Kraft can probably hold his head up high at the end of it. But yeah, I think it's an interesting way to finish off the show. But Erik, what can the listeners, you mentioned Spike Week at the end of the last show, but maybe some people didn't get to tune into that. Hit the listeners with it again.
Yeah, spikeweek.com. That's the website that I run, the first best ball, 100% best ball focused community. So we're not in the dynasty streets or any of that. You can come join our Discord. There's a link to that on the site. And what we focus in while we do rankings and we do content and we do strategy, just like everything else does. We have a YouTube channel, all of those things. We really focus in on the tools and data specifically for best ball to help you win when you're drafting, anywhere from tens to hundreds to thousands of best ball teams. We've built in particular 2 tools, but tons of data and everything else we call our draft hacker, which will overlay basically any information onto your draft screen while you are drafting to see your exposures and schedules and everything while you're drafting. It's totally customizable. And then our Draft IQ tool, which allows you, once you've drafted teams, to really dive into your portfolio and see, not just your individual player exposures. If I've drafted 30% of Ladd McConkey, what do those teams look like? Who have I paired him with? All that kind of stuff. So you can really actually create the portfolio of teams that you want across all of Underdog, DraftKings, and Drafters Fantasy. Check that out at spikeweek.com, all for just $40 a month. You get everything, rankings, tools, all that kind of stuff.
Awesome. Check it out. And thanks again to Erik for jumping on. This is something we haven't got to do podcast together before. I've been wanting to do it for quite some time. So this was awesome to jump on. You can follow Erik as well on Twitter at Erik Beimfohr. Check out spikeweek.com. You can check me out in social media at Overtime Ireland. Make sure you subscribe and get each podcast once it is available. But until we are back, have a good one.